The presenter of our main talk today is a member of our community, well known to everybody. Sometimes we have speakers from outside, sometimes we have speakers from inside the community talk to us about life, and Dennis has done many presentations here. He is an art scholar, an art teacher, and an artist, an incredible artist himself, and we always learn something amazing from him. Let's welcome back for the main talk today, our friend Dennis Fehr.
My topic is Nazi art, and I want to start with the fairly large subgenre of Nazi art that was about deifying Adolf Hitler. And this is one classic example of it, trying to make him look larger than life and heroic and almost deity-like. It's a very, very old tradition. In ancient Egypt, we see the pharaohs on the walls of the pyramids and other tombs much, much larger than the other depictions of humans back then. The notion of making the hero physically larger than other people. And the body language, his hand rather casually on his hip and gazing off in a visionary way into the distance. And Hitler really didn't look like this. Okay, next slide, please. Oh, by the way, I'm blocking the view of people over here. I'm sorry. It's an image-driven presentation, so if you want to move to another seat, it might actually not be a bad idea. As I was sitting back there, I was thinking, well, what about the people who can't see? That is an issue, so you might want to move. Okay, and another one, they were very predictably the same, these paintings that Hitler commissioned. And the same things I said about the last one apply here. He's looking off into the distance. His arm is raised in a very authoritarian, confident way. He is going to take Germany to great places. Presumably at this point, world domination. All we have to do is follow their Führer. Next slide. Now, here's the biography of young Adolf Hitler. He had a reasonably sophisticated visual eye. He painted this when he was a young man. He actually supported himself as an artist by selling his art to tourists, and was quite skilled. He was not a good artist because his work lacked passion, it lacked ideas, it had no messages, but it was technically skilled. This is a good example of what I'm talking about. Very careful rendering of kind of a human camera, as a lot of sidewalk artists are, but utterly devoid of any sense of passion, no ideas that make us think, nothing that makes art great, nothing at all. He was an illustrator. Next slide. Another Hitler painting. High level of skill, no content. Next slide. He painted buildings. That was what he did. And it turned out to be a popular subject. He was able to keep body and soul together by selling his art for a fairly long time when he was young, before he started, how shall I put it, his career in politics. Next slide. Very unusual slide because it actually has people in it. He was not a people person. And it shows in his art. Next slide. Okay, so Hitler, at a certain point, decides that he wants to go to art school. He applies to art school. The school that he applied to had an extremely small acceptance rate. They accepted about 1 application in 20. Hitler was rejected. Now this is a fake rejection, it's in English, that's a clue. Nevertheless, it illustrates the point. He was rejected and it infuriated him. He was certain that the school had erred in being blind to his talent. He had a pretty high opinion of himself as an artist. No idea really what art is about. No idea about what makes some art great and other art very pedestrian, like the stuff he did. But he thought of himself as an enormous talent, and he became very angry when he was rejected, and actually at that point began looking into social activism. So the debate is always, well, if he had been accepted into art school, would there have been no Holocaust? And the answer is possibly so. Possibly so. So then should we have open enrollment in all of the art schools? Okay, next slide. Now, all through his life, he considered himself an artist and a patron of the arts. And art was fairly important to Hitler and to the other Nazi leadership. And here we see him with his right-hand man, Joseph Goebbels, at a Nazi art exhibition. And I'm going to show you a fair amount of Nazi art this morning, and you will see that it tends to look, quote, the same in many ways. Anyway, here they are at an exhibition. Next slide. Now, Hermann Göring was, as you probably know, another henchman of Hitler's. And Göring amassed, through theft, an enormous world-class art collection of his own. Next slide. Here is the hallway of his opulent home, filled with European masterpieces that he pillaged from their rightful owners. Next slide. At the same time, Hitler, given the limited scope of his artistic mind, thought that the modernists, the Picassos and the Matisses, were degenerate and they were destroying art. And he was passionately opposed to them, so opposed that he would create art exhibitions of their work called in English degenerate art. I don't know how to pronounce it, but the two words in quote literally translate to degenerate art. And he had several exhibitions of this degenerate art so that the German people would come and see it and laugh at it. Now, a lot of the people that were lumped into this show ended up being icons of modernism that we learn about today in art history. Hitler persecuted them. Hitler drove Europe's most advanced art thinkers from the continent altogether. A lot of them went to New York City, and it was actually during World War II that the world's art capital shifted from Paris, where it had been for centuries, to New York City as a result of the Nazis and the kind of talent that he drove out of Europe that settled in New York City. Next slide. Oh.
Between slides here. Losing here. You sound great, man.
I sound great? Then why did you need to adjust your Okay. Here's one good example. I'm just going to take a little bit of a detour to talk about how to understand abstract art for like 1 minute. But Vasily Kandinsky, a Russian painter, was definitely lumped into the degenerate art crowd by the Nazis. And here Here we see a photograph of one of his works. This is literally taken from one of the degenerate art shows. The little, the sign in the lower right corner there that gives the title and stuff, presented in kind of a disrespectful, sloppy way. Next slide. Now here is a Kandinsky shown with a certain amount of respect. And you might look at it, if you don't know about modernism and you don't know about abstract art, you might look and say, what the hell? That would be a mistake. Number one, Kandinsky was also a musician. And he would paint art that depicted how music would look to him if he could see music. So that's an interesting entry point to the work of Kandinsky. He wasn't trying to do a Hitler-like, photograph-like image of the natural world. He had a different agenda, as many of the modernists did. And so just very quickly to look at how this is actually a rather sophisticated manipulation of line and color and shape. If we look at his use of color, we see blues, greens, pretty much the whole color wheel, and they are all placed sort of evenly around the space so that there is no area of this image that sort of falls apart, that doesn't do its part to contribute to the whole. It's a very unified image. The kind of energy is consistent throughout, whether it's line, color, or shape, except for red. He uses red differently. He divides the composition diagonally with kind of a heavy red line. He puts very obvious red spots up above the line and not really very much below it. So he is controlling the picture space, making a lot of conscious decisions that create a unified image of what he thinks music would look like if we could see. Okay, I can do a whole talk about that kind of stuff next time. Next slide. Nazi art. Ivo Salinger was one of Hitler's favorite artists. No need, if you're going to paint 3 nudes, to use 3 different models. Just use the same one and move her around. So we were in trouble already. But this is a very interesting reflection of Nazi gender definitions. We see here the male who is clothed, whose back is turned to us. We are not important to him. The 3 females are unclothed. They are on display for our male gaze. And they go back to mythology. There's a long tradition in the history of Western art. Wealthy patrons of the arts wanted to have basically the medieval or I guess post-medieval, Renaissance or Baroque period. A lot of these nobility wanted to have sort of the equivalent of today's Playmate of the Month or something on their walls, and the way to do that is to pretend that it was paintings of Greco-Roman gods and goddesses, mostly goddesses. Okay. Well, the Nazis continued that tradition. This is ostensibly a portrayal of a myth about the judgment of Paris. He's deciding which of these 3 is the most beautiful. Basically what it is Nazi soft porn. Next slide. Same thing, the 4 elements. Again, saving money on models. And the figures are, oh, this is a different artist, Adolf Ziegler, but you see how they look the same. The figures are pretty stiff and lifeless, and if you look at the human body by our greatest artists, for example, that's one you will all know, Michelangelo's sculpture of David, there is true elegance. There is a true understanding of body language and gesture, and it utterly absent here. Kind of clumsy and awkward. The poor thing on the right is going to tip that table over, and she's about to slide off of it. Next slide. The nude male also is a subgenre of Nazi art, and Arno Breker was probably Hitler's favorite sculptor, and here is an example of his work. When I Googled Arno Breker to get images for my talk today, it took me to a gay art site, which was interesting, giving kind of a subtext to the Nazi attitude toward the male body. Next slide. There's Arno working on a sculpture. Next slide. Okay, art about the family, another major subgenre. Very clearly demarcated gender roles, not just with mom and dad, but with the children. Let's take a look. We have the mother invariably holding a child, so that everybody is clear about why women exist. The father always looking authoritarian and in charge. Note here that the father is placed higher in the picture space than the mother. Note that the sons are looking toward us and the daughter is not. Looking toward us being a more powerful placing, a more powerful way to pose the subject. Next slide. Again, the mother here with the baby at the breast, and the father, again, is the leader of the family. Next slide. And again, and again, and again, and again, the same formula. Nazi art was among the most formulaic art I've ever seen. I've seen a lot of art. The artist had to follow certain rules. The one on the left, we have the older son wearing Nazi youth garb and looking at us already in kind of a almost threatening way, somewhat echoing the gaze of the father. Both of them looking directly at us. The other son, the younger son, also looking directly at us. The mother again holding the baby, not looking at us. The daughter learning what her role in life is by being faced toward the mother. All these codes that reoccur. The one on the right, much the same. The father much larger, the dominant figure in the picture space. And the mother once again, of course, with the baby. Next slide. Attention to the young people of Germany was a big deal to the Nazis, because if they were going to truly take over the world, and they believed that they would, they needed to have the young people coming up in a constant supply of efficient members of Nazi society. So here we have that Aryan purity kind of look, which interestingly Adolf Hitler himself did not follow. He was not blonde or blue-eyed, and yet in literally all of their art, we see the Nordic ideal represented, unless they are portraying people who are not Nordic, and we're about to see some images of them that are anything but flattering. Next slide. More of the Hitler Youth, the Aryan superiority. Next slide. Then there were the Jews. Fairly common topic in Nazi, not so much their, quote, fine art, which was the nudes and things like that, but in their popular art, in posters, in magazine covers, and in commercial art. There was a lot of that. And Jews were fairly often the subject of that. And here we see a very typical example of it, the Jew being portrayed very unflatteringly, bothering the Nordic female, posing a threat. The Jews posed a threat to German women. Next slide. This is actually an illustration from an elementary school book. So when you were 6 or 7 or however old you were when it was your turn to study from this book, this is one of the images that you saw. How different from the books we looked at when we were in elementary school. The socializing of the youth to be anti-Semitic actually predates Hitler by generations. It was an intrinsic part of the German worldview long before Hitler was born. He did not start it at all. He capitalized on it. He exploited it. And so the notion that Jews are subhuman, that they are going to destroy the fatherland, that they are a threat to our women, was just a commonly accepted attitude in Germany for a long time. Next slide. Keep this, it will bring you luck. I couldn't find any information about this image. It just came up in my image search, and it's in English, so obviously it's not German, but the theme of it, the content, is very much obviously Nazi. Keep this, it will bring you luck. Keep the swastika. That will bring you luck. And just a little aside, as a cat lover, I know that if you ever do that to a cat, tie a ribbon to its tail, it's not going to sit there happy. A certain amount of artistic license with the cat. Next slide. More of commercial art, denigrating portrayals of Jews, making them look monster-like, emphasizing the notion that they are a serious, serious threat.
That's in Dutch. The poster on the left is in Dutch, not in...
I'm sorry?
The poster on the left is in Dutch, it's not in German, just for your...
Oh yeah, we, Verena and I went back and forth a little bit about this. She did a superb job of translating, but there are some of them that were, like, we think one was in Russian, and so, anyway, work with us.
Yeah, that one's in the Tate Museum in London. I got to see it.
Really? That
Yeah.
poster?
Yeah.
What's the Tate doing with that?
They had a whole exhibit.
Oh, an exhibit. Okay, all right, good. Next slide. And yet more. There's tons of it, just tons of it. Here we're actually blaming Hitler's war on the Jews. Next slide. And blacks, gays, gypsies, and Jews, and modern artists. All bad. Next slide. Some anti-gay images. Next slide. Oh, and the mentally ill. Add that to the list. The imagery portraying the mentally ill is almost the hardest to look at, because the mentally ill of all those groups is would have found it hardest of all to defend themselves against. And the Nazi treatment of the mentally ill was vicious. Vicious. Next slide. Now, the Nazi relationship with the Christian church was interesting. Hitler was not interested in theological questions, but he at times saw political opportunities to align himself with Christianity. And so there is some Christian symbolism within Nazi iconography. And here's one example, turning the cross into a swastika, trying to establish a connection, give Nazi ideology a Christianized legitimacy. Next slide. And we see that today. This is actually a couple of weeks, this photograph is about 2 weeks old.
That's the English Defense League.
I'm sorry?
That's the English Defense League.
The English, yeah, and which is a neo-Nazi group. Yeah, this was taken in Dover, England, at a protest, and notice the Christian cross on the flag, again seeking legitimacy in that sense. Next. And of course, the Klan, it goes without saying that the Klan and the neo-Nazis are overlapped. I'm moving now into what the Nazi movement has become and how it exists today. And it's throughout Europe, and it's actually growing now because of the immigrant issue that is troubling the United States as well as a number of European countries. Next slide. These two photographs show what's called the Iron Cross. It has a Viking origination. The Vikings came up with that cross with 4 arms of equal distance, and it was revived in medieval art, and then the Nazis revived it again. And so we still see it here in the case of the Klan, but it's also very popular with the neo-Nazis. Next slide. I found these kind of interesting spins on the American flag, the U.S. flag, the kind of showing what the Nazi vision for the United States is and what our flag might look like when the neo-Nazis finally come to power, when the rest of us wake up and realize that everything they said about Jews and blacks and gays is all true. Once we wake up and see that, we will have a flag that might look like one of these. Next slide. Wait. We are 501c3. That is a generic image that does not resemble any one specific person. I'm simply using the flag motifs to show you that. I think that's it. Is there anything? Next. One more? Okay.
Who did that one?
Oh, I don't know who did it. Some commercial artist did that. Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah, okay. Well, that's it. Are there any questions or anything? Yes. Actually, I do have one closing remark. I've studied Nazi art for years, and there have been times when I'm looking at it that I think this thought. Actually, I grew up in a kind of an isolated religious community, and I remember hearing Adolf Hitler praised when I was a boy. And my parents did not buy into that, so I never had anything but a negative view of him. But it's made me think, what if when I was 7, my school book had an image like the one that I showed you? And what if I grew up and came of age and formed my worldview in a culture where the lesser value of groups other than mine, I'm as Aryan as can be, I'm 100% from both sides of my family, Swiss. Groups other than mine were inferior to mine and posed a threat to mine. And that this assumption was held by every influential adult in my life. And then suddenly, a charismatic speaker who, quote, tells it like it is, comes to power and says, it's time for us to stop this before it overtakes us. Now maybe I'm 17 years old, and I'm encouraged to join the Hitler Youth and actually do something for my country, do something that makes my parents proud of me. And I become a Nazi soldier. And maybe I'm a guard at a concentration camp. One thing leads to another. And now I'm participating in that barbarity, utterly convinced that I'm on the moral high ground. Could have happened. It happened to millions of young Germans. If I had been born a couple generations earlier in Germany, it could have happened to me. Could have happened. So it made me think, there's a difference between beliefs that I hate and the people who hold those beliefs. There's a little difference there. And it's one I want to keep well in mind as I go through my life. Being able to separate the two. So I guess that's my main point today. Thank you.
Just speak loud today because we're running short on time, so don't wait for the mic, just stand up.
Okay.
Sorry, we don't have.
How do you compare this with the, during the World War II, how do you compare it with the anti-Japanese and subsequently the anti-communist propaganda posters about? And how do you
That we
compare
had here in the United States?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, in the United States.
Yeah, I've done talks on U.S. war propaganda from World War I and World War II, where we see images very much like what we see here of Japanese portrayed as monsters and Nazi soldiers portrayed in like demons and things like that came from the United States too. And the inhumane treatment that not only the Japanese are the best known for what happened to them, the ones on U.S. soil were put into camps, but also Germans and Italians were put into camps here on U.S. soil, not just the Japanese. So, you know, there's a little dirt to spread around to everybody. Yes?
Is there any out there art portraying the Native Americans? Because you know, we ended up with them all, we killed, put into
Yeah, what we did to them is vastly worse than anything we did to Japanese Americans.
Hard to lead that kind of propaganda.
There is, and because of our decimation of the Native American, we reduced the Native American population by 90%, either violently or with imported diseases. That's the effect that we had on them, 90% death. And yes, there are images that made it easier. The whole deal is to make it easier for people to do harm. So it happened in Native Americans. Anything else? I'm sorry if I ran over.
No, we're good. No, I mean, we're just, I guess, keep it on track.
All right then, thank you.
Thank you, Dennis.